Hi, I'm Dr. David Adams. In this two-part session, we'll be reading together from Isaiah chapter 51, verses 1 to 6. This passage contains two closely related oracles that follow on a motif introduced at the end of the third of Isaiah's servant songs, found in the previous chapter. At the end of that servant song, we find a series of passages beginning with an exhortation to the hearers to pay attention to what God is doing in chapter 50, verses 9 and 11. Chapter 51 continues this motif with a series of further exhortations in which God calls upon the hearers to listen and look at what he's about to do. Our text is a part of that sequence of exhortations. Also, since our text is poetry, we'll be paying attention to some of the poetic features of the passage in Hebrew. So, grab your Hebrew Bible and let's get started. In the first part of this session, we'll focus on verses 1 to 3 of Isaiah 51. Turning to Isaiah chapter 51, verse 1. Shemu Elai Rodifei Tzedek Muvakshe Yahweh. The exhortation begins with a call imperative, masculine plural. Shemu, listen, followed by the preposition el with a first person singular suffix. Listen to me. The intended audience for this exhortation is identified by the next two phrases, each beginning with a participle. Rodifei Tzedek. Here we have a call participle, masculine plural, construct form, from the common verb radaf, meaning to pursue or to chase after. So we might read this something like, pursuers of righteousness. This is a good example of the way that Hebrew sometimes uses the participle instead of asher, to introduce a clause that modifies or provides additional information about a person or a thing being discussed or addressed. In grammatical terms, we call these relative clauses. Since in this case the clause is identifying the person being addressed, in English we'd probably add the pronoun you to make it clear to the reader that these are the people being spoken to. And so we would probably end up translating the whole phrase something like, you who pursue righteousness. The next phrase expands upon this thought by specifying how the hearers will pursue righteousness. Muvakshe Yahweh. Here again, we have a participle, this time a piel, masculine plural construct, from bikesh. You can tell it's a piel because of the schwa under the preformative and the pathak under the first root letter. By the way, there are 225 occurrences of this verb in the Tanakh, and all of them are in the piel. So the Hebrew verb bikesh means to seek. So again, we'd probably read this as a relative clause. You who seek Yahweh. So the people being addressed here are those who pursue righteousness by seeking Yahweh. This leads us to the next point. What is it that Isaiah wants those who seek Yahweh to do? The exhortation continues. Habitu el tzur kutzavtem. This is an instruction. So we have here a hiphil form, an imperative masculine plural, from the first nun verb nabat. Notice the dagesh forte representing the assimilated nun in the consonant base. This word has a little stronger connotation than the more common verb ra'ah, to see. So we probably understand it to mean something like look at or stare at or even pay close attention to. In this case, the object sur, or rock, is attached to the preposition el. Now, if we took the time to look up this verb nabat in the lexicon, we would find that the object of the attention that's being called for by the verb is frequently marked with a preposition. Sometimes, like here, it's the preposition el. Other times it's the preposition lamed, or even the preposition beith. But this usage of a preposition to mark the object of this particular verb is pretty common. But there's one more element here, the verb form kutsavtem. Now with the tem ending, this is obviously a verb in the perfect aspect. So the form is a pual perfect, second masculine plural. And the root is chatzav, meaning to quarry or to hew out or to dig out. Now, this phrase is a little tough to put together, but remember, this is poetry. And in Hebrew poetry, words that were regarded as less necessary were often omitted. The verb here appears to be part of a relative clause that's giving us some information about the rock. So we would probably want to supply the English words necessary to signal that we have a relative clause. So we'd probably end up translating this phrase something like, pay attention to the rock from which you were hewn. The next phrase builds on this idea and expands on it. Vu'el makaveth bor nukertem. And to the makaveth bor. Now, this is the only place in the Tanakh where this phrase mukaveth bor occurs. So it will take some thought to understand it properly. A bore is basically any kind of hole that's dug in the ground. It's commonly translated as something like pit or cistern. And it can even refer to something that we might call a basement in the sense of an underground space below the floor of a structure, although these are fairly rare in biblical buildings. It can even refer to a grave. Here this word bore is part of a construct chain with makeveth. This noun occurs 5 times. Most of the occurrences are used to refer to a tool, probably what we would call a hammer or a mallet. But this noun is related to the verb nakav, which means to pierce or to bore through. Some think in this context a makeveth refers not to a tool, but to a place where the action has occurred. Remember, Hebrew nouns formed with a main prefix often designate places. So this would be a place that has been pierced or bored out, or we might say a place that was dug out. The idea of this construct phrase, remember, it's an expansion on the preceding thought and stands in parallel with the word tsur or rock. The idea is probably the place that something is dug out from. So in the context, the construct phrase makeveth bor is frequently rendered by English translations something like excavation or quarry. The next word is from the verb nakar. Here it's in the pual perfect as well. A nakar is a synonym of chutzav in the preceding stitch, and it has basically the same meaning, to bore or to dig out. So putting all this together, we might translate these two phrases something like, pay attention to the rock from which you were hewn, the quarry from which you were dug out. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, what's all this talk about rocks and quarries about? Well, remember, this is poetry, and Hebrew poetry often uses figurative language. In the next verse, we'll find out what this rock and quarry refer to. Habitu el Avraham avichem. The verb habitu is repeated from the preceding verse. Pay attention to Avraham Avikim. Abraham, here modified by an appositive, Avikim, your father. The next clause continues this thought. El Sarah tucholekim. And to Sarah, that's easy enough, but the word tucholekim is a bit of a tricky form. Notice the tau on the front and the kim at the end. Now we know from the context that this has to be a verb form. So the tau preformative on the verb form tells us that this is either a feminine third singular imperfect form or a masculine second singular imperfect form. Remember, those two forms are identical. The kim at the end is a second person plural masculine object suffix. But what about the root and the pattern of this verb? We have three apparent root letters, Cheth, Lamed, Lamed. Now, whenever you have a root or an apparent root with the last two consonants the same, you know you're dealing with either a geminate verb or a hollow verb in the second theme. And remember, by second theme, I mean those patterns that are the equivalent of the piel, pual, or hithpael of the strong verb. In this case, see the schwa under the prefix and the holum after the first root letter? They let you know that we're dealing with a second theme form. Second theme forms almost always have a schwa under the preformative. But that doesn't help you determine whether the root is geminate or hollow. But we know that it has to be an active form because of the object suffix. So it will either be a poal form of a geminate verb, cheth lamed lamed, or a polal form of a hollow verb, cheth yod lamed. Unfortunately for us, both of these verbs actually occur in the Tanakh, and they're reasonably common for weak verbs. So we'll probably have to look this one up to figure out which one it is. That happens sometimes. Well, when we look it up, we'll find that it is a polal form of the hollow verb cheth yod lamed, chayil. This means to be in pain or to writhe or twist with pain. It's used with women to talk about giving birth for obvious reasons. It's also used figuratively as a metaphor for being in great pain or suffering in general. Here, in this context, we're talking about Sarah and Abraham. So it makes sense that we will take it as a way of referring to giving birth here. So putting this together, we'd probably translate this phrase something like, look at Abraham your father and Sarah who gave birth to you. Now, that's all fine, but what is the point of our looking to Abraham and Sarah? What are we supposed to see when we look at them? The next clause answers that. Ki ekad karathu wa uvarkehu wa arvehu. I love the assonance, the poetic repetition of sounds that we have in this phrase, especially because it follows on the reference to Avraham, which also sounds similar to this. With this phrase, we have the perpetual problem of how to understand the particle ki that introduces the clause. Now, without rehearsing all our options for ki, let me just say that here there seem to be four reasonable possibilities. First, it could be introducing an explanatory or exegetical clause. In that case, we would translate it because or for. Second, it could be introducing a temporal clause. In that case, we would translate it when. Third, it could be introducing a concessive clause. In that case, we would translate it something like even though. Finally, it could introduce an emphatic or asseverative clause. In that case, we would translate it something like surely or certainly. Now, any of these four work grammatically, and you could fit most of them into the context, and you can find examples of them if you compare various translations, because translations disagree on how to take this. Personally, I'm inclined to take this as an explanation. The reason that I will take it as an explanation is because it follows the exhortation to look at Abraham and Sarah, and it explains what the prophet wants us to look at them to see. So I'm going to read it as because, but that doesn't solve all of our problems with this phrase. Being poetry, this is a little tricky, so we're going to have to go slowly here. Ki ekad karathu. Now, the words are not hard here, though the meaning is difficult. If we read it kind of woodenly, we might read it as, because one, I called him. That's a little odd sounding. It's not clear what it means yet. Let's finish the thought and see if we can then put it together and figure it out. Avarkehu harbehu. I just love that assonance. Here we have two piel forms. The first is from the verb barak, to bless, and the second from the verb rava, third hey verb, meaning to multiply or to increase or to make large in number. So these two phrases set up a contrast between the circumstances of Abraham when God first called him and the circumstances that resulted from God's keeping his promise to bless Abraham in Genesis 12 and elsewhere. Understanding that helps us to know how to translate that difficult phrase, because one, I called him. In this context, the one refers to the fact that Abraham didn't have any heirs when God called him in Genesis 12, and that's a major part of the story of Abraham, his getting an heir in the person of Isaac. So the point of the number one here is to highlight the fact that Abraham was by himself. He was alone. This is what we might describe as the adverbial use of the number one. It's the same use we have in the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4, where we should translate, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is your God, Yahweh alone." So I would read this line as, because Abraham was alone when I called him. And here I understand this wow as being adversative, introducing the contrast, highlighting the change in Abraham's circumstance. But I blessed him by, and I'm understanding the second wow as introducing a clause of specification. That is, a clause that indicates the specific way in which God's blessing was carried out, by increasing him numerically, or we could say by multiplying him. Or perhaps, if we wanted a more functional translation that would be clearer to modern readers, we could even translate this a little loosely by saying, by giving him many descendants. So let's put all of verse 2 together. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who bore you. Abraham was alone when I called him, but I blessed him by increasing him in number. So now we start to see the shape of the prophet's message. He's encouraging God's people to remember the way that God has blessed his people in the past and kept his promises to them. God's past actions are the basis of Israel's hope and ours too. That becomes more apparent in the next verse. Ki nikam Yahweh Tzion, nikam kol chobotheha. Well, here's our old friend Ki again. Just a moment ago, we had this introducing the explanation of why the people of God should look to Abraham and Sarah. So we might be inclined to think that this is another explanatory clause. But I think we have to wait until we see what the rest of the sentence says before we know for sure how to take this particle ki. So let's look. Nikam Yahweh Tzion. Nikam is one of those verbs that has two very different senses depending on which pattern it's used in. It's used in the nifal with the sense of be sorry or regret or change your mind. But in the piel, which is what we have here, it has quite a different emphasis. It's used to communicate the idea of extending comfort or consoling. Isaiah uses this verb, necham, 17 times, mostly after chapter 40, which quite famously begins with this word in the phrase, nachmu, nachmu ami, comfort, comfort my people. Here, Yahweh comforts Zion. I would take this piel perfect not as a past tense, but in what we would call the durative sense, meaning that this is Yahweh's ongoing action. This is what God does. God comforts his people. Necham kobortheha. That's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? He comforts all korbotheha. This is the noun chorba. Note that it's a short O, not a long A. And it's a feminine plural with a feminine singular suffix. Feminine singular because place names like Zion are generally feminine in Hebrew. This sound is used to talk about a place that is in ruins or a place that is devastated. In Hebrew, the word has the connotation of being dried up. And by the way, this word is also related to the name of the mountain of God in the book of Exodus, Mount Horeb. So God will comfort all of Zion's ruined, devastated, dried up places. And the rest of this verse fills out this picture by giving us an example of how God comforts his people. But remember, this is poetry, so the message is going to come to us in figurative language. How does Yahweh comfort Zion? Vayasim midvara ka'eden. He will make her wilderness like Eden. Arava kahagan Yahweh. And her Arabah like the garden of Yahweh. In the poetics of this passage, the word Arava stands in parallel with Midbar, wilderness, in the previous clause. And the garden of Yahweh stands in parallel with Eden. As you no doubt know, the word Arava can serve as a common noun for any kind of dried up or desolate place. But as a proper noun, it refers to that geological fault line that continues the Jordan Valley south of the Dead Sea to the place where it joins up with the Gulf of Aqaba. This is what that area looks like. And as you see, it's pretty dried up and desolate. So the term is quite appropriate for what Isaiah is saying here, and it echoes the word korvah earlier. In the age to come, even this dried up and desolate place will be made like the Garden of Eden. Arava and wilderness, midvar, and dry or devastated places, chorva, are all clearly complementary terms intended to reinforce one another in the poetics of the passage. This imagery recalls an important theme in the Tanakh, that in the age to come, God will restore the fecundity of creation. This imagery of creation as a restored Garden of Eden is a common theme in the prophets, but perhaps nowhere more fully fleshed out than in Ezekiel's vision in chapter 47, in which a river of life-giving water that will flow out from the presence of God in the temple will water the wilderness of Judea and restore the desert and make even the Dead Sea alive and teeming with fish again. This idea is behind Paul's statement about the restoration of creation in Romans 8:20 and following, and also especially in John's great eschatological vision in Revelation chapter 21 and the beginning of chapter 22. And our text is one of a number of places where Isaiah reflects this theme as well. Then he continues with this theme of what the age to come will be like. Shashon wasimcha yematseva. Gladness, shashon, and joy, simcha, will be found. Here the verb is a nifal imperfect of matzah, so it is passive. Gladness and joy will be found in her, that is, in Zion. Todah v'kol zimra. Thanksgiving, todah, and the voice, or perhaps better, sound of a song. Notice that there's no verb in this last phrase. As we read this, we need to keep in mind that the verbal element in the previous poetic stitch, yematseva, there will be found in her, applies to this stitch as well. This happens a lot in Hebrew poetry. When an element, often a verb, functions in more than one clause, we say that that element is doing double duty. Seeing that, we would put this together and understand it to say something like, so gladness and joy will be found in her, and joy and the sound of singing will also be found in her. Here too, we get imagery that's often employed by the prophets, the rejoicing of creation and the song of thanksgiving and joyful praise offered up by the people of God in response to the fulfillment of all God's promises. Well, before we leave verse 3, we should go back and think about that key that begins the verse. In the light of what the rest of this verse says, it doesn't really seem to be an explanation for why the people of God should pay attention to Abraham and Sarah. Rather, it seems to me that the point here is the way in which God is going to keep his promises to his people. This is what the age, initiated by God's suffering servant, spoken of in the previous chapter, the Messiah, will look like when it's fully revealed. This is the hope of Israel, and indeed it is our hope as well. So I don't think I would take that key as explanatory. I would take that key as asseverative, that is, to be introducing an emphatic clause. As a result, I'm going to read the whole verse something like this. Surely the Lord comforts Zion. He comforts all her desolate places by making her wilderness like Eden, her Arava like the garden of Yahweh. Gladness and joy will be found in her, thanksgiving and the sound of a song. Verse 3 brings us to the end of this thought unit. A new thought unit begins with verse 4, and we'll take a look at that in the next part of this session. But before we leave this part, let's summarize what the prophet has said. He calls upon the faithful people of God, those who pursue righteousness by seeking Yahweh, to look to the example of how God has kept his promises to Abraham and Sarah in the past by blessing him, so that Abraham would have a multitude of descendants that God promised him in Genesis 12. The language here also recalls the language of Genesis 1, where God promises to bless Adam and Eve so that they would be fruitful and multiply. So the first thing is that we should be confident that God will keep his promises to us as well. But what will it look like when God keeps his promises to us? God promises to restore all of creation, to put it back the way he intended it to be when he created it, before the fall, before it was corrupted as a result of the unfaithfulness of Adam and Eve, before disease, before suffering, before death became the common experience of every living thing. After reminding his audience of how God has kept his promises in the past, the prophet looks to the future and emphasizes how God will comfort Zion by restoring the fruitfulness of creation in the age to come. That's the message of the first 3 verses of this reading. Well, that sounds great for creation anyway, but it leaves us with another question. What about us? What will happen to us? In the next part of this session, we'll look at another aspect of the restored creation that will result from the work of God's servant. I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me for the first part of this study, and stay with me for the second part, in which we'll look at Isaiah chapter 51, verses 4 to 6.